Rome, late 1930s. Europe was marching toward war. In Berlin, Adolf Hitler spoke about destiny and empire. In Rome, Benito Mussolini promised the rebirth of the Roman state. But in a quiet apartment filled with strange books, ancient symbols, and Eastern manuscripts, there lived a man who believed both dictators misunderstood the true nature of power. His name was Julius Evola. He was not a general. He commanded no army. He held no political office. Yet some of the most radical thinkers of fascist Europe came to listen to him. Evola believed that modern civilization was collapsing. Democracies, industrial society, mass culture, to him they were all signs of decay. The world, he argued, had fallen from an ancient and sacred order that once ruled humanity. Long before the modern age, Evola claimed, there had existed a spiritual aristocracy, a small elite of warriors and initiates who possessed not only political power, but mystical authority. Kings were not simply rulers. They were initiates. Warriors were not just soldiers. They were members of sacred orders, guardians of hidden traditions that stretched back thousands of years. According to Evola, modern Europe had forgotten all of this, and that forgetfulness was fatal. In his books and essays, he called for something extraordinary, the creation of a new ruling class, an elite bound not by democracy, but by discipline, tradition, and spiritual power. Some readers dismissed him as an eccentric philosopher. Others saw something far more dangerous, because Evola was not writing only about theory. During the 1930s and the years of the Second World War, his ideas quietly circulated through radical circles in Italy and Nazi Germany. Officers of the SS, intellectuals inside fascist institutions, and members of occult societies began reading his work. One of his most famous books carried a title that sounded less like philosophy and more like a declaration of war against the modern world. Revolt against the modern world. To Evola, the coming conflict in Europe was not merely a political struggle. It was something deeper, a spiritual war between two visions of civilization, the modern democratic world, and the ancient hierarchical order he believed had once governed humanity. And if that ancient order were to return, Evola believed it would not come through elections or reforms. It would come through a new elite, a small circle of men who understood the forgotten traditions of power, a spiritual aristocracy. In time, historians would debate whether Julius Evola was simply an eccentric philosopher, or the intellectual center of one of the strangest ideological cults to emerge in Europe during the Second World War. To understand how such ideas gained followers, we must go back to the beginning. Because Julius Evola did not start his life as a political thinker. He began as something far more unexpected, an avant-garde artist searching for transcendence in the ruins of post-war Europe. Long before he became one of the most controversial thinkers of the fascist era, Julius Evola lived a completely different life. He was not a political theorist. He was not a philosopher of power. He was an artist. Evola was born in Rome in 1898 into a family of Sicilian aristocratic background. His father worked as an engineer and expected his son to follow a respectable career. Evola was even sent to study engineering. But the young Julius had no interest in conventional life. Instead, he was drawn to rebellion, intellectual, artistic, and spiritual. When World War I erupted, Evola served as an artillery officer in the Italian army. Like many young Europeans of his generation, the war changed him profoundly. The destruction, chaos, and collapse of old empires left deep scars on the continent. But for Evola, the war created a different question. If the old world had collapsed so easily, perhaps it had already been hollow for centuries. When the war ended in 1918, Europe was in crisis. Monarchies had fallen. Revolutions erupted across the continent. New ideologies fought to fill the vacuum left behind. In this atmosphere of uncertainty, Evola did not turn to politics. he turned to avant-garde art. During the early 1920s, he became involved with the radical artistic movement known as Dada, a chaotic and anti-traditional style that rejected logic, order, and conventional aesthetics. Dada artists believed modern civilization had proven its absurdity through the horrors of war. Evola quickly gained recognition inside the Italian Dada circle. He produced strange and experimental paintings filled with abstract shapes and symbolic imagery. He also wrote poetry that challenged traditional forms of language and meaning. But even among avant-garde artists, Evola was searching for something deeper. Many Dadaists believed the answer to the collapse of civilization was artistic rebellion. Evola believed rebellion alone was not enough. He wanted transcendence. During the early 1920s, he began reading texts that few modern intellectuals took seriously. His interests drifted toward the forgotten corners of philosophy and mysticism. He studied Hermeticism, the ancient tradition of spiritual transformation; Buddhist philosophy, especially ideas of detachment and spiritual awakening; Tantric traditions from India and Tibet; medieval alchemy, which he believed symbolized inner transformation rather than primitive chemistry. Gradually, Evola came to a radical conclusion. Modern civilization had lost something essential. According to him, ancient societies had once possessed a sacred structure where political authority, spiritual knowledge, and warrior power were united. Kings, priests, and warriors formed a hierarchy rooted not only in law, but in cosmic order. The modern world had destroyed this structure. Democracy, mass society, and industrialization had replaced spiritual hierarchy with what Evola saw as mediocrity and chaos. These ideas pushed Evola further away from art and deeper into philosophy. In 1925, he published one of his earliest major works, Essays on Magical Idealism. The book revealed how far his thinking had moved from the artistic circles of his youth. Evola now argued that true power did not come from politics or economics. It came from inner transformation, the ability of certain individuals to dominate both themselves and the world around them. He believed only a small minority possessed this potential, a spiritual elite, a group of individuals capable of standing above the modern age rather than being shaped by it. By the late 1920s, Evola had abandoned painting entirely. He no longer wanted to change culture through art. He wanted something far more ambitious: to rebuild an entire civilizational order based on ancient traditions, warrior ethics, and spiritual authority. And Europe, moving rapidly toward political extremism, was beginning to look like the perfect stage for such ideas. Soon, Evola would discover that powerful men were willing to listen. By the late 1920s, Julius Evola had completely abandoned the world of avant-garde art. Paintings and poetry were no longer enough. Europe, he believed, was entering a decisive moment in history. The old world had collapsed after World War I, but the new world that replaced it looked even worse in his eyes. Democracy, mass politics, industrial society. To Evola, these were not signs of progress. They were symptoms of civilizational decline. He began developing a radical philosophical system that he believed explained why modern society was collapsing. At the center of this system was a controversial idea, the concept of spiritual race. At the time, racial theories were already spreading across Europe. In Nazi Germany, thinkers promoted the idea of biological superiority based on blood and genetics. But Evola thought this was too simplistic. In his view, true hierarchy did not come from biology alone. He argued that race existed on three different levels. First was the race of the body, physical traits such as appearance and ancestry. Second was the race of the soul, psychological characteristics, temperament, and cultural identity. But above both of these was the most important level, the race of the spirit. According to Evola, This spiritual race defined the true elite of humanity. These were individuals who possessed inner discipline, courage, and a sense of sacred order. They were capable of rising above ordinary life and embodying what he called the aristocratic principle. In ancient civilizations, Evola believed, this spiritual elite had ruled naturally. He pointed to examples from history and mythology. The warrior aristocracies of ancient Indo-European cultures, the samurai class of Japan, medieval knightly orders in Europe. In these societies, Evola claimed, warriors were not just soldiers. They were members of a sacred hierarchy. Their authority came not from elections or popularity, but from their spiritual strength and their connection to ancient traditions. Modern civilization, however, had destroyed this structure. The rise of democracy and mass society had replaced aristocratic elites with what Evola called the rule of quantity, a system where political power was decided by numbers rather than quality. For Evola, this was the ultimate corruption of civilization. In 1934, he published what would become his most famous book, Revolt Against the Modern World. The book was not simply a political manifesto. It was a sweeping reinterpretation of human history. Evola argued that ancient civilizations had once been guided by sacred traditions rooted in cosmic order. Kings ruled not merely as administrators, but as spiritual authorities, connected to divine principles. But over centuries, this sacred structure had gradually collapsed. The modern age represented the final stage of this decline, a world dominated by materialism, consumer culture, and political systems that rewarded mediocrity rather than excellence. Evola believed the only solution was a restoration of hierarchy. A new elite had to emerge, not politicians, not bureaucrats, but individuals who understood ancient traditions and possessed the strength to live above the moral and political chaos of the modern age. He called these individuals men of the tradition. For Evola, they represented a kind of spiritual warrior. And although he never officially led a mass movement, his writings began attracting attention among radical intellectual circles across Europe, especially among those who believed that the coming political upheavals of the 1930s might offer an opportunity to rebuild society from the ground up. Soon, Evola would find himself entering the dangerous world of fascist politics, a world where some leaders were eager to hear ideas about hierarchy, power, and destiny. But they would also discover something unexpected. Even among fascists, Julius Evola was considered extreme. By the early 1930s, Europe was rapidly transforming. Economic collapse, political instability, and the lingering trauma of World War I had pushed many societies toward radical ideologies. In Italy, Benito Mussolini had already consolidated power and established a fascist state. In Germany, the Nazi Party was rising quickly under Adolf Hitler. For many intellectuals across Europe, these movements appeared to offer a solution to the crisis of the modern world. For Julius Evola, however, the situation was more complicated. At first glance, fascism seemed close to what he wanted. It rejected liberal democracy, promoted hierarchy, and glorified discipline and warrior virtues. But Evola believed the fascist revolution was incomplete. In his view, fascism remained too political, too modern, and too focused on mass mobilization. What Evola envisioned was something far more radical, a return to what he called the traditional order. In 1930, Evola began publishing articles in a number of Italian intellectual journals. Among them were the influential magazines La Torre and Il Regime Fascista. In these essays, he argued that fascism should not simply be a political system, but the foundation of a deeper spiritual transformation of society. He called for the creation of a new aristocracy, not one based solely on birth or wealth, but on inner strength, discipline, and spiritual authority. To Evola, The ideal society would resemble the ancient warrior cultures he admired. A hierarchical civilization led by an elite trained not only in politics and warfare, but also in philosophy, symbolism, and sacred traditions. However, this vision placed him in a difficult position within fascist Italy. While Mussolini's regime tolerated intellectual debate, it was also wary of ideas that challenged the authority of the state. Evola's writings were often so abstract and esoteric that many fascist officials did not know what to make of them. Some saw him as an eccentric philosopher. Others considered him dangerously radical. In 1930, Evola founded a short-lived journal called La Torre, the Tower. The magazine openly criticized aspects of the fascist regime, arguing that it had become too concerned with political compromise and mass propaganda. The publication lasted only a few months before it was shut down. Despite these tensions, Evola continued writing throughout the 1930s and gradually attracted a small but devoted audience among fascist intellectuals. Some readers were drawn to his harsh critique of modernity. Others were fascinated by his unusual combination of politics, mysticism, and ancient symbolism. At the same time, Evola's ideas began crossing the borders of Italy. In Nazi Germany, certain members of the intellectual circles surrounding the SS were developing similar interests in mythology, symbolism, and the supposed spiritual origins of European civilization. Organizations like Ahnenerbe, founded in 1935 under Heinrich Himmler, were exploring ancient traditions, archaeology, and racial mythology in an attempt to construct a deeper ideological foundation for the Nazi state. Although Evola was not a member of the Nazi Party or the SS, his writings attracted attention in these circles. He traveled several times to Germany and Austria during the late 1930s, meeting with scholars and intellectuals interested in traditionalist philosophy and esoteric history. Evola also began publishing articles in German-language journals, discussing topics such as secret societies, initiation traditions, and the spiritual structure of ancient civilizations. Despite this growing influence, Evola remained a controversial figure even among fascist thinkers. While Nazi ideology emphasized biological race and nationalism, Evola continued insisting that the most important form of hierarchy was spiritual, rather than purely racial. This difference sometimes placed him at odds with more rigid racial theorists within the Nazi movement. Yet the overlap between Evola's worldview and the broader atmosphere of authoritarian and mystical thinking in Europe during the 1930s allowed his ideas to circulate quietly within radical intellectual networks. By the late 1930s, a small circle of admirers had formed around his work. Not a mass movement, but something more unusual. An intellectual brotherhood of readers who believed Evola was pointing toward a deeper revolution, one that would go far beyond the political struggles of the moment. But the outbreak of World War II in 1939 would soon change the context of these ideas completely. As Europe descended into total war, Evola would move closer to the mysterious world of secret archives, ideological research projects, and the hidden intellectual battles taking place behind the front lines. And in that shadowy environment, his philosophy would encounter some of the most powerful and dangerous institutions of the Nazi state. When World War II erupted in 1939, Europe became more than a battlefield of armies. Behind the front lines, another struggle was unfolding, an ideological war over the meaning of history, race, and civilization. Within Nazi Germany, several institutions were dedicated not only to military power, but also to constructing a mythological foundation for the Third Reich. One of the most unusual of these organizations was the Ahnenerbe, founded in 1935 under the authority of Heinrich Himmler, the powerful head of the SS. Officially, the Ahnenerbe was a research institute devoted to studying the ancient origins of the German people. In practice, it operated as something far stranger. Its scholars investigated ancient Germanic mythology, Indo-European migrations, pagan rituals and symbols, medieval secret societies, and even mystical traditions from Tibet and Central Asia. The goal was not simply historical curiosity. Himmler and several SS intellectuals believed that the Third Reich represented the rebirth of an ancient Aryan civilization, a civilization whose spiritual foundations had been lost over centuries. This was precisely the kind of idea that Julius Evola had been writing about for years. During the early 1940s, Evola increasingly found himself interacting with German intellectual circles connected to the SS. He traveled frequently to Vienna and Berlin, where he gained access to archives and libraries containing documents on Freemasonry, secret orders, and revolutionary movements. At the time, Nazi authorities were deeply interested in understanding the networks they considered ideological enemies, especially Freemasons, whom they believed played a role in spreading liberal and democratic ideas across Europe. Evola was asked to help analyze captured Masonic archives and documents that had been seized in several occupied countries. For Evola, this work had a different meaning. He believed that secret societies were not merely political organizations. Many of them, he argued, preserved fragments of ancient spiritual traditions, distorted perhaps, but still connected to older systems of initiation and symbolism. This research fit perfectly with Evola's broader worldview, the belief that beneath the visible surface of history existed a hidden struggle between different spiritual forces and traditions. During this period, Evola also maintained contact with intellectuals within the SS cultural apparatus, some of whom were exploring similar themes. However, Evola's relationship with Nazi ideology remained complicated. While he shared the Nazis' hostility toward modern democracy and liberalism, he continued criticizing what he saw as the biological obsession of Nazi racial theory. For Evola, race could not be understood purely in physical terms. True hierarchy, he insisted, depended on spiritual qualities, discipline, inner authority, and a connection to ancient traditions. Some Nazi thinkers found this perspective intriguing. Others saw it as impractical mysticism. Even so, Evola's writings circulated quietly among certain SS intellectual circles. His books, especially Revolt Against the Modern World, and later Synthesis of the Doctrine of Race, 1941, were discussed in small ideological networks that attempted to merge political ideology with mythological and historical narratives. Unlike many propagandists of the regime, Evola never became a central public figure in Nazi Germany. He operated on the margins, a philosopher moving through the shadowy world of ideological research and esoteric speculation. By 1943, however, the situation across Europe had begun to deteriorate rapidly for the Axis powers. Allied armies were advancing, cities were being bombed, and the grand visions of ideological transformation that had fascinated so many radical thinkers were beginning to collapse. Evola had moved to Vienna, where he continued his research in German archives. It was there, in the final chaotic months of the war, that his own life would change forever. Because in 1945, as Soviet forces pushed into the city and the skies above Vienna filled with bombs, Julius Evola would find himself caught in the violent end of the world he had spent decades trying to reshape. Unlike many political thinkers of his time, Julius Evola never attempted to build a mass movement. He did not organize rallies. He did not lead a political party. In fact, Evola openly distrusted mass politics. To him, movements that relied on crowds and propaganda were already signs of civilizational decay. Real power, he believed, belonged not to the masses, but to a small elite capable of standing above history. This belief shaped the kind of followers he attracted. By the late 1930s and early 1940s, Evola had gathered around him a small but intense group of admirers. They were not ordinary readers. Most came from intellectual or aristocratic backgrounds, journalists, officers, scholars, and radical thinkers searching for a deeper ideological foundation behind the political upheavals of the era. Many of them felt that both fascism and National Socialism were missing something essential. Yes, these movements had restored discipline and authority, but they had not restored spiritual hierarchy. Evola's writings offered something different. His books described the possibility of a hidden tradition that stretched across centuries, a sacred knowledge once held by warrior elites, priestly orders, and initiatory brotherhoods. According to Evola, fragments of this tradition could be found in many ancient civilizations. He pointed to examples such as the knightly orders of medieval Europe, the samurai class in Japan, the aristocratic warrior cultures of ancient Indo-European societies. In each case, Evola argued, power was not simply political. It was initiatory. Warriors were trained not only in combat, but also in spiritual discipline. Authority came from inner transformation, from mastering fear, desire, and weakness. This idea resonated strongly with some young intellectuals living in a continent consumed by ideological conflict. Within Evola's circle, a phrase began to appear again and again: men among the ruins. It described individuals who refused to fully participate in what Evola considered a decaying civilization. Instead of trying to reform modern society, they would stand apart from it, preserving inner discipline and ancient values until a new order could emerge. This concept later became the foundation of Evola's 1953 book, Men Among the Ruins. But the idea was already circulating among his followers during the war years. What made Evola's circle unusual was its atmosphere. It was not exactly a political organization. It was not quite a philosophical school either. Some historians have described it as a kind of intellectual brotherhood, united by a shared rejection of the modern world. Members of this informal network corresponded through letters, essays, and private discussions. They debated ancient mythology, comparative religion, medieval symbolism, and the structure of warrior cultures throughout history. Evola encouraged them to see themselves not as activists, but as something closer to guardians of a forgotten tradition. Yet, outside this small intellectual circle, the world was descending into catastrophe. By 1943, the Axis powers were already losing ground. Italy itself had collapsed politically. Mussolini's regime fell in July 1943, and the country plunged into chaos as German forces occupied much of the north. Across Europe, the vast ideological visions that had inspired so many radical thinkers were beginning to crumble. But Evola continued his work. While bombs fell across the continent and armies closed in from all sides, he remained focused on his research into ancient traditions and secret societies. And in the final months of the war, in the city of Vienna, that obsession would place him directly in the path of one of the most devastating moments of his life. Because in 1945, as the war reached its violent conclusion, Julius Evola would pay a permanent price for remaining so close to the collapsing world of the Axis. By 1945, the world Julius Evola had spent decades trying to influence was falling apart. The Axis powers were collapsing on every front. In the West, Allied armies had crossed the Rhine and were advancing deep into Germany. In the East, the Soviet Red Army was pushing relentlessly toward the heart of the Reich. Cities across Europe were burning under relentless bombing. For many intellectuals who had tied their ideas to fascist regimes, this moment meant exile, arrest, or silence. But Julius Evola was still working. He had moved to Vienna, which by that time had become an important center for Nazi ideological and archival work. Large collections of documents from across occupied Europe had been transported there, including materials seized from Freemasonic lodges, political organizations, and secret societies. Evola spent much of his time studying these archives. He believed that buried inside these documents were clues to the deeper ideological struggles shaping modern history. Conflicts between secret networks, revolutionary movements, and remnants of older spiritual traditions. While the war raged outside, Evola remained absorbed in these investigations. Then, in January 1945, the war reached Vienna. Allied bombing raids intensified as Soviet forces approached the city. Explosions echoed through the streets. Entire districts were reduced to rubble as the Third Reich fought desperately to hold its remaining territory. During one of these air raids, Evola was caught in the open. A powerful blast wave struck nearby, throwing him violently to the ground. Shrapnel and debris tore through the area, and Evola suffered a devastating spinal injury. When the bombing ended, he could no longer stand. Doctors later confirmed the damage was permanent. Julius Evola, the philosopher who had written so extensively about warrior elites and spiritual strength, would spend the rest of his life paralyzed from the waist down. The war soon ended. In April 1945, Soviet forces captured Vienna. Germany surrendered weeks later, and the fascist regimes that had dominated Europe for more than a decade disappeared almost overnight. For many of Evola's associates, the aftermath of the war meant interrogation, imprisonment, or exile. Evola himself was briefly investigated by Allied authorities because of his connections with fascist intellectual circles and his research work during the war. However, he was never charged with war crimes or membership in Nazi organizations. Instead, he returned to Italy, confined to a wheelchair, but still intellectually active. Physically, his life had been permanently altered, but the collapse of the Axis did not silence him. On the contrary, in the decades after the war, Julius Evola would begin writing some of his most influential works, books that continued spreading his ideas to new generations long after the political world that inspired them had disappeared. When the war ended in 1945, much of fascist Europe vanished almost overnight. The regimes that had dominated the continent were dismantled. Leaders were imprisoned, executed, or forced into hiding. Ideologies that once promised a new world suddenly became politically toxic. For most thinkers connected to those movements, this meant silence. But Julius Evola refused to disappear. Confined to a wheelchair after his injury in Vienna, he returned to Rome and began rebuilding his intellectual life. The physical limitations that now defined his daily existence did not weaken his sense of mission. If anything, the defeat of the Axis only strengthened his belief that the modern world was entering an even deeper crisis. In the post-war years, Evola shifted the tone of his work. He no longer wrote as a philosopher advising political regimes. Instead, he began writing for individuals who felt alienated in the modern democratic world that emerged after the war. His message became more personal, but no less radical. In 1951, Evola was even put on trial in Italy for allegedly inspiring neo-fascist activists. Authorities suspected that his writings had influenced radical youth groups involved in extremist political movements. During the trial, Evola defended himself in a striking way. He argued that he had never supported mass political activism at all. Instead, he claimed his philosophy was aristocratic and spiritual, directed toward a small elite rather than street movements or revolutionary organizations. The court ultimately acquitted him, but the trial only increased his reputation among certain radical intellectual circles. In the years that followed, Evola wrote several books that became central texts for his followers. Among them were Men Among the Ruins, 1953, Ride the Tiger, 1961. These works presented a strategy for living in what Evola considered a completely degenerate modern world. Since modern civilization could no longer be restored immediately, Evola argued that individuals of strong character must adopt a different attitude. They must learn to ride the tiger. The phrase came from an ancient metaphor. If a man finds himself riding a tiger, He cannot safely jump off. The only way to survive is to stay on the tiger's back and wait for the right moment. For Evola, modern society was that tiger. The world of consumer culture, mass democracy, and technological society could not be stopped, at least not yet. But individuals with spiritual strength could survive it without being spiritually destroyed by it. This idea resonated strongly with a small but dedicated audience. Across Europe, particularly in Italy, France, and Germany, Evola's books began circulating among intellectual groups interested in traditionalism, philosophy, and radical critiques of modernity. His followers never became a mass movement. Instead, they resembled something closer to what Evola himself had always envisioned, a scattered network of individuals who believed they belonged to a hidden spiritual aristocracy. Some historians later described this as the quiet survival of Evola's cult of the spirit. Not a cult in the traditional sense of rituals or organized membership, but a philosophical brotherhood connected by a shared worldview. And even decades after the fall of fascism, the strange influence of Julius Evola continued to echo in unexpected places. His books were read by radical political thinkers, philosophers of traditionalism, and small intellectual circles searching for alternatives to modern society. For supporters, Evola remained a defender of ancient traditions. For critics, he was one of the most dangerous ideological figures to emerge from the intellectual world surrounding fascist Europe. But whether admired or feared, one fact remained clear. The philosopher who had once dreamed of a spiritual empire had succeeded in creating something unusual. Not a state, not a political party, but a set of ideas that refused to disappear. By the late 1960s and early 1970s, Europe had changed dramatically. A new generation had grown up in a completely different world. The continent was rebuilding after the devastation of World War II. Liberal democracies dominated Western Europe, consumer culture was expanding rapidly, and political debates were increasingly shaped by the Cold War. To many people, the ideological battles of the 1930s seemed like distant history. But Julius Evola believed the deeper crisis of civilization had only intensified. From his apartment in Rome, where he spent most of his later years confined to a wheelchair, Evola continued writing essays, books, and philosophical reflections. Visitors, often young intellectuals, journalists, and controversial political activists, came to meet the aging philosopher, whose ideas had survived the collapse of fascist Europe. Evola's influence during these years spread quietly through books rather than organizations. Works such as Revolt Against the Modern World, Men Among the Ruins, Ride the Tiger began circulating internationally. In these writings, Evola continued defending his core idea, that modern civilization had abandoned sacred hierarchy and replaced it with systems based on materialism, mass culture, and political equality. To him, these changes represented not progress, but civilizational decline. Some readers interpreted Evola's work as a philosophical critique of modernity. Others viewed it as a justification for radical political movements. By the late 20th century, his books had begun appearing in unexpected places. Certain far-right intellectual circles in Europe rediscovered his writings. At the same time, some scholars studying traditionalist philosophy and comparative religion examined his ideas in an academic context. This strange dual legacy made Evola one of the most controversial thinkers of the 20th century. To supporters, he was a philosopher who defended ancient traditions and spiritual hierarchy against the excesses of modernity. To critics, he represented one of the most sophisticated ideological voices connected to the intellectual environment that had surrounded European fascism. Yet, despite the controversy, one fact remained undeniable. Evola's ideas had outlived the political world that first gave them attention. And unlike the dictators and regimes of the 1930s, his writings would continue circulating long after his death. Julius Evola died in Rome in 1974. He was 76 years old. By the time of his death, the Europe that had shaped his thinking was gone. The fascist regimes had disappeared decades earlier. The continent was moving toward greater political integration, economic growth, and democratic stability. But Evola never believed that modern society represented the final stage of history. Throughout his life, he argued that civilizations moved in cycles, rising, declining, and eventually being replaced by new orders. In his writings, he often returned to a central idea: that behind the visible surface of politics and history existed deeper forces, traditions, myths, and spiritual principles that shaped the destiny of civilizations. For Evola, the modern world had simply forgotten them. Whether his ideas represented philosophical speculation, political extremism, or something in between remains a subject of debate, even today. But one thing is certain: in the turbulent decades of the 20th century, when ideologies fought for control of Europe and entire societies were transformed by war and revolution, Julius Evola stood apart from the political leaders around him. He did not try to command armies. He did not seek public power. Instead, he attempted something stranger, and perhaps more enduring. He tried to build a philosophy that would survive the collapse of the modern world. And for better or worse, more than half a century after his death, people are still arguing about whether he succeeded.